Now, more stories, insights, and analysis of Illinois policy and politics. This is Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute. Once again, your host, AM 560's Dan Proft.
Dan Proft back with John Tillman, President and CEO of the Illinois Policy Institute. And John, the meeting that was supposed to happen this week between Bruce Rauner, governor, and legislative leaders didn't happen, got postponed to December. But some additional progress for Rauner. Negotiated another public sector union contract with SEIU. But there's still the big one out there. That's with AFSCME. It represents most of the state workers. And I wonder how that will factor in your estimation, to the conversation ultimately that Rauner, Cullerton, and Madigan are going to have the first week of December, and what kind of budget deal can be worked out.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see a budget deal, actually. I think that this is going to continue. I think it's all going to be posturing. I don't think we see a budget till to sometime in 2016. The way this is unfolding is Madigan's play is that the longer it plays out, he thinks the more pressure on Rauner, and I disagree with that. If Rauner plays the cards right, and of course our guest who's about to come on has written about this, and I do think that the governor has a lot of cards, so I think he will not cave, and will use it for optics to illustrate that it is the Democrats, and particularly Madigan, who are the stubborn ones, and I think that's the real game here.
And that guest, John just referenced, is Steve Malenga from City Journal, Manhattan Institute publication. Steve is the editor of City Journal. He writes routinely, really an expert on public sector pensions and the problems with public sector pensions in places like Illinois, and wrote a piece similar to what John is suggesting, that Rauner holds the cards. Steve, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So when you look at Illinois from an outsider's perspective, why do you say Rauner holds the cards in this budget showdown? Because a lot of people, a lot of longtime observers and people that have gotten used to the Chicago Democrat political culture here look at what's happening with this 5-month impasse over the budget and say, well, actually, it's Chicago Democrats who control the General Assembly that have the cards.
Well, of course, they control the Assembly, and also they control, obviously, Chicago and a number of other institutions. But here's the thing. All of these institutions need money. Rauner, by not signing a budget, is essentially saying, I am not going to free up money until you pursue the reform agenda that I want. And in particular, if you look at the situation, the standoff now as it relates, for instance, to the schools, and especially Chicago public schools, they have a huge hole in their budget, $480 million. They need help from Springfield. And Rauner says, well, we can talk about this, but it has to be within the context of reform. In other words, I'm not just going to spend money to bail you out unless I get something back in return. And so in that respect, you know, as long as he sticks to it, and as long as he's willing to take whatever political flack comes, and we know that when it comes to funding schools, there's often a lot of political flack, he holds a big advantage because they need the money.
Steve, you've alluded to just now, and it's really well written in your piece as well, that it seems a little different. This governor is a little different than the Republicans that Madigan has long negotiated with. Previous Republican governors, Thompson, Edgar, and Ryan, the way I like to put it, were partners in the deal. So they would negotiate, they would divide up the pie, they would a little pain here, a little pain there, a little get for both sides, and they would make a deal. And many times then, during that period of time, as well as when the Democrats had full control, the Republican negotiators in the legislature would take the Democrats at their word. Okay, we'll make this revenue budget deal with you, and then we'll get our reforms later. And of course, the ball would be pulled, and they would never get those reforms. You've pointed out quite well, I think, that this governor seems to actually want the reforms first before he gives them any kind of quid pro quo.
Well, I think there are two components to that. Number one is you ought to learn from history. Right. And if Rauner is just observing the way politics has been done in Illinois during the period that has gotten the state into so much trouble, he can see that reform has been very, very difficult. But the other part of this is one of the reasons you find pressure on legislators from either party to make these kinds of deals is because so many of them are professional politicians. They need to be reelected. Mm-hmm. If Rauner is not worried about being reelected, if he's not worried about sticking around long enough so that he can get an Illinois government pension, then he can say, listen, I'm willing to take the heat. In general, good reformers have to do that anyway, and particularly in their first or second year when they have a mandate.
And the other thing I think is interesting is that the governor is aware of, and that the local media mavens seem not to want to write about, is that the public is extremely aware that the Democrats have had monopoly control of the General Assembly and are the architects of the current crisis, and the public has an approval rating of the General Assembly of 8%, approval rating of Speaker Madigan of 20%. Now that's an interesting thought, but I think the bottom line is in the end the governor has to make Democrat legislators fear their own voters more than they fear Speaker Madigan and the unions.
Well, it's so interesting you say that. First of all, a Democrat who did reform is Gina Raimondo in Rhode Island. And when she did reform on pensions, number one, she was a venture capitalist. This was her first, basically her first job in politics. She certainly didn't need it because she'd been a successful venture capitalist. Secondly, when she did reform, one of the things she did was she went around selling it to the people of the state first. And she tells a story about how when Democratic legislators, and they're members of her own party, came in and said, I can't vote for your pension reform bill even though I know it's right because the unions tell me that if I do, they'll vote me out of office. Her response was, I've been to see your constituents, and if you don't vote for it, they're going to vote you out of office. So that has to, I think, be the strategy. Rauner has to just keep making that point to people. I didn't create this problem. The reason the problem has been sustained is precisely because this is the way they do business in the state capitol, and I'm trying to change that.
He is Steve Malanga. He's the senior editor of City Journal and the author of the book Shakedown, The Continuing Conspiracy Against the American Taxpayer. Steve, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.